Well, this winter it seems like it's been all about Vireos. This is another small painting. It is a 7 by 10 inch transparent watercolor of a yellow-throated vireo on a red twig dogwood. I sure love these cute little birds, and it was a blast to paint its vibrant yellow and olive greens against the purple gray and the red twig dogwood branches. I transferred my sketch using tracing paper. I'll add a link to a video I made of outlining that process in more depth later. Once transferred, I masked off the foreground elements using liquid frisket. Once the frisket was completely dry, I pre-mixed all my background colors. I wanted to have a nice soft background, so I planned a wet-on-wet wash. So I pre-wet my background with water, ensuring it was evenly saturated. Once everything was nice and wet, using a 1-inch flat brush, I put in a gradient of purple-gray to a slightly more reddish purple at the bottom. The purple-gray used dioxazine purple, phthalo blue, phthalo green, and cadmium red. And the bottom reddish purple that had some of the same basic colors, except it had a little bit more cadmium red in it. While that background was still wet, I used number 4 round brush to bring in some background branches. My background trees were mixes of cadmium red medium, permanent alizarin crimson, phthalo green, and dioxazine purple. I have to move pretty quickly so those pigments will spread out in the background wash and look soft and out of focus. It happened to be a super low humidity day, and the background was starting to dry a lot faster than I anticipated. If I continued putting in more of those background branches with the paper at that point, they were likely to backrun. So instead I hit the entire thing with the hairdryer and then re-wet the whole page before bringing in more background branches. Those were spreading out nicely and softly across the page, suggesting a loss of depth of field or focus. Once those were sitting right on the page, I locked them in with the hairdryer. Now that those fuzzy background elements are in place, I wanted to add in some middle ground branches, so I faked in a lot of the background. I wasn't specifically following my reference photos at this point. I did pay attention to the overall size and the opposite branching pattern of the dogwood bush before putting them in. Once I dropped in a handful of those middle ground branches, I hit the entire thing with the hairdryer and then removed the liquid frisket. Next, I transferred the foreground sketch lines to the white of the paper. I always try to cover up the white of the pages as soon as possible. I started with the branches, using mixes of cadmium red, permanent alizarin crimson, and chrome orange with a little phthalo blue or dioxazine purple to desaturate the colors in places. I try to wash in my lightest local colors and then glaze in darker and darker as I go, building saturation and contrast. The bird's first washes were all lemon yellow with a touch of cadmium yellow medium. And his back was a mix of dioxazine purple, alizarin crimson, chrome orange, and a little bit of phthalo green. Unfortunately, I encountered a lighting issue at this point, so try to ignore all of the banding. Sorry about that. I'll have that fixed in the next video, I promise. The rest of the painting was really just thousands and thousands of glazing brush strokes to build texture. Mostly I used a number 2 round brush and slowly got darker and more opaque as I went along. In doing all these background branches, I chose to put in more color variation than I had in my photo reference. Basically, I wanted to control the colors, so there would be some progressions and gradients to help move the viewer's eye through the painting. I had some areas more saturated in colors, others might be darker or more purplish, and maybe some others would be browned up a bit. I like to incorporate some gradients in those colors. There were some that went from orange to red or red to brownish tan, and those gradients will hopefully add some interest in the finished painting. If all those branches were the exact same color, saturation, and contrast, it would end up being boring and often those up looking flatter to the eye. I'll leave the elements that I want in the background with less saturation and contrast, so those will recede as a middle ground object. Less can be more with these. Your viewer's brain kind of fills in a lot of the details in areas like this. At first, I was painting around all the lenticels. Those are the little white dots that you see on the red twig bark. Those little features actually are there for a reason. They're used for gas exchange through the bark. Eventually, I put in some dots of frisket over them to speed things up, I thought. Unfortunately, I put in a little too many of the dots, and it got a bit out of hand. Eventually, I painted over many of the things I had put frisket on, and then made them even smaller than they were. Partway through, they were starting to look a little bit like salt on a pretzel. Not exactly the look I was going for. This is one of the disadvantages of doing transparent watercolors. With transparent watercolor, if you see white in a painting, it's the white of the page. And it can be tough to spare a tiny detail like those little white dots on the branches. With opaque watercolor or gouache, you can just paint the branches all that red color and then add some little white dots at the end super quickly. With transparent watercolor, it's not so easy. Now, only a portion of my butcher's tray is visible. For the twigs, I was using the same basic colors that I mentioned before, and then adding shading with alizarin crimson mixed with dioxazine purple, phthalo blue, or French ultramarine. As the back of the bird was glazed in, I started using more phthalo green, lemon yellow, and a little bit of chrome orange or cadmium red to get more of those olive colors. You can see from the palette about how thick and opaque the colors were that I was glazing in. Like most vireos, these are classy little woodland birds that you hear way more often than you see them. I actually have very few good photos of them in the wild, but I've been lucky enough to see these super close at a bird banding station, and they are spectacularly gorgeous birds. I had a lot of good photo reference of these birds from a banding station that's nearby, but my actual photo reference was from a trip to Northwest Ohio, and it was kind of a lousy photo, but it had potential. In the photo that I had, the focus was soft and the background was super busy, but I thought the overall idea in the photo was sound. If I could clean up the background a bit so it was less busy and yet still have a good sense of place and depth, that would be a good start. Changing the overall lighting to a less backlit option was also a necessity in this one too. Well, the birds are always the fastest parts of these paintings to do, for me at least. The belly went in with some of the same reds that the branches used to bring in some reflected light, and as well as using some dioxazine purple and phthalo blue. The blackish colors of the wing feathers, those were mixes of purple grays that I made using dioxazine purple, phthalo blue, phthalo green, and a little bit of permanent alizarin crimson. For the tiny details of the beak, the eyes, and the toes, I did pull out a 10-aught brush to get in those tiny, tiny, tiny details. After a lot of picking away and glazing, I ran out of things that I wanted to do on this painting and things to fix, and I called it a day. Thanks for taking the time to watch the yellow-throated Vireo watercolor take shape. I hope you find some time to break out the watercolors and paint this week.